Hey guys, Miss Steffi here. I am going to walk you through Unit 3 review, which is going to be our cultural patterns and processes unit. There are only 7 standards, so hopefully this goes pretty quick. Okay, here we go. Starting with standard 3.1, that's Introduction to Culture. There are 3 parts of this. The first is what culture is comprised of. Number 2 is cultural traits, and number 3 is going to be cultural attitudes, which is going to include the difference between cultural relativism and ethnocentrism. All right, what culture is comprised of? It's shared practices, technologies, attitudes, and behaviors. An example I put up at the top for shared practices is a common thing that is shared around the world is maybe going to school. Okay, you have materials, you have a teacher, but obviously depending on where you live, that school setting is going to look different. And then at the bottom, behaviors, make sure you know those are learned. I put an example of how we greet each other. What's interesting is this is obviously going to change due to COVID-19, and we're going to have to relearn ways we greet each other. Okay, cultural traits is going to include food, language, architecture, and land use. Food is going to be very symbolic with culture because it brings people together. Also, the location determines what foods are grown locally and readily available in parts of that region. Food is also going to be tied to religion and rituals. It also reflects history and migration. All right, analyzing food, we can look at maps of who consumes what where. A quick 4-level map analysis of where meat consumption is highest and lowest across the globe. If we look at the where it's the lowest, we'll see it's in parts of Africa and South Asia. The why there in South Asia is going to be because a large population in South Asia is Hindu. And the why is because they don't eat beef. And the so what is this big because they believe that cows are sacred. We can also look at where it's the highest, say in the United States. This is going to be directly tied to economics and what is available and tells you why the United States grows so much corn so it can be fed to the cattle. Language is another trait of culture, and we talked about this in class. This is kind of fun where we talk about parts of the United States where pop, Coke, and soda all mean the same thing, but different regions say it differently. All right, architectural traits is going to be part of culture as well, and it's going to be a reflection of our built landscape, how we build at that time, so traditional versus modern. It's also going to depend on materials available at that time in the environment. All right, the last aspect of culture is going to be attitudes. We can talk about gender equality and how that changes our attitudes. We can also talk about ethnocentrism versus cultural relativism. So cultural relativism is going to be where you're trying to understand somebody else's culture without judging them. You see the culture as it is. You're learning to see it in a different perspective versus ethnocentrism as you view that culture as, oh, that's really stupid, or ooh, that's really gross, and you are not being open-minded and having a different perspective. So the next standard is standard 3.2, which is cultural landscapes. There's 2 parts to this standard. Now, Carl Sawyer was a human geographer that actually coined the term cultural landscape. He was determined to stress that culture is the force that shapes the visible features of the Earth's surface in areas that humans are using. So breaking it down, the main characters of cultural landscape are going to be language, religion, architecture, sequent occupants, land, and land use patterns. Over to the side, I just have an example of a farm in Iceland that dates back to 19th century. And you can see when the weather was really cold or harsh, you would be able to jump from building to building. You also see that grass is grown on top of the roofs, and that was to provide more isolation in cold weather. So language is very visible on cultural landscape. A great example is toponyms. That was one of your note terms that just means place name. It could be towns, streets, parks, schools, buildings. We see this named after famous people, maybe religious figures, or even developers. Some examples of religious toponyms can be in Quebec. It shows the impact of religion on landscape as many cities and towns are named after saints. And did you guys know that Montana means mountain in Spanish? So another great example of a toponym. Okay, you also see religion expressed on landscape. Usually it's going to be through architecture, but it doesn't always have to be. You see it in sacred spaces. You also see religious symbols, and as we saw in the previous slide, in topiums. Now you also see architectural patterns on landscape that aren't religious. Make sure you understand that those are usually designed with elements or materials that are available in that region. So for example, Japan and Sweden are going to be very heavily forest, so they're going to use a lot of wood in their architecture. Also note that you're going to see differences between traditional versus modern architecture, and that modern architecture doesn't always reflect the culture as much as tradition. Sequent occupants is also a characteristic of cultural landscape. That's where you have a footprint that populations come in after cultures and will leave their mark, and later societies leave their cultural imprint on a place. Examples of this would be little Chinatown in New York City from the influx of Chinese immigrants. You also see French characteristics influenced in New Orleans because that's where the French settled during the colonial period. Okay, next, standard 3.3, we're just going to be looking at cultural patterns. So these patterns are going to be through landscapes of language, religion, ethnicity, and gender. So we see language patterns, for example, in the South where they say y'all versus the North where we say you guys. We ask the questions, what is this place about? Who are these people? And you get a sense of place by looking at patterns of language. All right, another pattern is religious patterns, a type of cultural pattern. We can look at this on different scales. Here's an example of religious patterns on a global scale, and Christianity is representing purple. So we can see from there that people in the United States are Christian. However, if you look at religious patterns on a national scale for the United States, you can see a lot of variety there, like Southern Baptist is in red, you have Catholic in blue, and so forth. And it just goes to note that whenever you are reflecting on data, is it always correct? Is it always accurate based on scale analysis? Another characteristic of cultural patterns is going to include attitudes towards ethnicity and gender. That includes the role of women and also our ethnic neighborhoods. Examples of ethnic neighborhoods, remember these shape a cultural area through chain migration, such as Little Havana in Miami, which is the Cuban culture, and also say Little Italy in New York City. Okay, so in regards to attitudes towards gender inequality and looking at patterns, we can see a global map of the gender gap, and then the darker areas are going to be where the gap is larger between men and women. Obviously, Saudi Arabia sticks out. I know we talked about Rwanda after the genocide in class and how women really took a leadership in the aftermath of that, and you see them ruling in Congress. You also see them in a lot of entrepreneurship. Okay, so this slide is super important. You might even want to pause the video and snip it and put it into your study guide. These are going to be the factors which create centripetal and centrifugal forces. The centripetal is going to be in green. These are all the things that pull, factors that pull people together in a region, and then centrifugal is in red, and that is factors that pull people apart. Some examples on there, which you might not be familiar with as physical features, can be an opposing force. Also, poverty. We saw an example of that in former Czechoslovakia, where one side was an industrial economy, the other side was agricultural, creating an opposing force. Make sure you can also categorize these in an ESPN situation. So how do we keep populations and countries together? If we look at a global map of showing refugees, asylum seekers, and IDPs, what is going on in that area to create people to want to leave? what forces are happening there. And when we attack our FRQs, we have got to use that 4-level map analysis sequence, the what, where, why, there, and so what. Okay, next standard is 3.4 types of cultural diffusion. Diffusion is the interaction of people. It contributes to the spread of any cultural practices. So you're going to need to be able to define types of the cultural diffusion. I would caution you and not leave it at that. Make sure you know how to apply these with examples as well. Okay, so before we dive into this, make sure you understand that there are really two main types of diffusion, which is relocation and expansion. Within expansion, you have 3 more types of diffusion branched out from that, which is hierarchical, contagious, and stimulus. Starting with relocation, that one's pretty easy to remember. That is just the act of people physically moving, and that is going to be mostly seen through migration. We see a little bit of what is happening in our border with Mexico, and that is a shift. You also see this in a lot of our ancestral landscapes. Okay, let's look at the expansion diffusions. Remember, there's 3 types. It's going to be contagious, hierarchical, and stimulus. Before we talk about stimulus, let's decipher the difference between hierarchical and contagious. Contagious is where you want to think of like COVID-19 and while we're in our houses right now. This is going to expand very, very rapidly, and it's going to hit everything in its path. Versus hierarchical, you want to think of maybe pop culture. Intent is going to spread, but it's not going to reach every single area or every single person due to lack of access, such as money or technology. Now, our third expansion diffusion is going to be what's called stimulus. You guys probably remember us talking about this in class with McDonald's. This is where you have a spread of an idea, but it's going to reflect the culture, so it's going to be adapted or modified a little bit. So a great example is through restaurants, especially McDonald's. So in India, because their population is mostly vegetarian, they offer the McVeggie. I believe in the McDonald's in Japan, they have rice patties and shrimp on the menu. It would also be a good idea to know your culture horse. This is where everything evolves out of these areas. You could snip this and also include it in your weekly review. If you want to dive deeper into the cultural diffusions, I've embedded Mr. Sin's video into that slide. Okay, moving along here, standard 3.5 is going to be the historical causes of diffusion. You need to be able to explain how historical processes have impacted what we currently see today in cultural patterns. Some of these historical diffusions have been through colonialism, imperialism, and trade. And you can see this map, how many countries in the past have been under European control. We can specifically think about Great Britain, where Great Britain colonized, and what kind of impact Great Britain had. That is going to be the diffusion of the English language and also Christianity. An example of these conquests is definitely going to be relocation diffusion. When we look at countries that speak Spanish, for example, those were brought over by the Spanish conquistadors. At that time of colonialism, Spain was dominant and spoke an Indo-European language. And so that's why we see Indo-European being a dominant language family across the globe. Following these conquests, you're going to have missionaries that are introducing religion, bringing religion over as well as language. In this map, you can see where Christianity is dominant in those purple areas, and that is again going to be influenced during that colonial period. Just make sure that you can make connections from these historical patterns to what you see today in these countries. Definitely, you don't need to memorize every single language. I would be familiar with the 2 main language families, which is Indo-European and Sino-Tibetan. You can see where those have flourished, how Indo-European, again, has dominated the world, just again, because those countries in Europe were colonizing. And you can see that Sino-Tibetan has stayed pretty isolated in East Asia. All right, we're getting there. Standard 3.6. This is contemporary causes of diffusion. Be able to explain how contemporary processes are going to impact current cultural patterns. So we're going to break these down in the next few slides. So cultural ideas and practices are socially constructed, and they can change through both small scale and large scale processes such as urbanization and globalization. Now, these processes come to bear on culture through all these different things like media, technology, politics, economics, social relationships. And then remember, creolization is where elements of different cultures are blended together to create a new culture. And then lingua franca is a language that is adopted as a common language between two speakers whose native languages are different. And they may come together with a lingua franca so that they can trade and do business together. Communication technologies such as the internet and time-space compression, they're reshaping and accelerating interactions among people. So examples of some of these changes in cultural practices can include the spread of English. Remember when we watched the TED Talk on English Mania, all the Chinese desperately learning English? When we have that, then we also have a change where we have the loss of indigenous languages as one becomes more prominent. Also know the difference between cultural convergence and cultural divergence. Cultural convergence is theory of two cultures that will be more and more alike as their interactions increase. So an example of that will be like global sports, like the Olympics, the spread of English. A cultural divergence, however, it refers to a separation of one whole society or culture and forms a totally new distinctive faction. So an example of that would be the Amish. Next standard is 3.7. It's going to be the diffusion of religion and language. In this standard, you're going to need to be able to explain what factors led to the diffusion of universalizing an ethnic religion, and also what led to the diffusion of languages. All right, religious hearths and diffusion of religion. This might be a good map to snip it and blow up so you can zoom in and see some of the routes. But make sure you know that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, their hearth is going to be in the Middle East, and then Hinduism and Buddhism is going to be the Indus and the Ganges River. Okay, this is just another map of the culture hearths, and that is just where everything begins. Probably a good idea to be familiar with these areas. Now, this standard also mentions knowing diffusion of language families, including Indo-European. Know that Indo-European languages have a huge number of branches. Those include the Anatolian, Indo-Iranian, Greek, Italic, Celtic, Germanic, Armenian, Tocharian, Balto-Slavic, and Albanian. These branch languages were predominant in the Asia portion of Turkey and then some areas of northern Syria. It's probably not a bad idea to have some understanding of where English has diffused. You can look at this map and see 90 to 100% of English speakers in the green areas, and then down to the red, which is the least likely areas, 0 to 5% of English speakers. This standard also mentions diffusion of religious patterns and distributions that can be visually represented on maps. So this one is diffusion of universalizing religions. So universalizing religion is a religion that attempts to operate on a global scale, and it appeals to all people wherever they reside. The universalizing religions are going to be Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Sikhism. The way that these diffused was through expansion and relocation diffusion. Now, ethnic religions are primarily attracted to one group of people living in one space, staying very isolated. The ethnic religions are going to be Judaism and Hinduism. And here's a map of the diffusion of those two religions, and they are diffused through relocation. It's also a good idea to be familiar with how religion impacts cultural landscape through its architecture. So we'll quickly go through and look at some photos here. So Christianity often has featured tall steeples topped with a cross. Churches that are closer to the hearth are going to be more to the original style, like close to the Mediterranean, they have domed roofs, but European churches have really steep roofs. All right, Hinduism. Hindu temples are very elaborate. You can see from the photo there, they have big carved exteriors. One of their sacred sites is going to be the Ganges River. The Hindu bathe in there. They believe that it brings purification. The Hindus also practice cremation. They often spread the ashes in the Ganges River, and they do believe in reincarnation. Okay, Judaism. So Jews worship in synagogues or temples. Jews are also spread throughout the world. The reason for that is because of them being exiled and persecuted throughout the years, and this is known as diaspora. They also usually bury their dead. Okay, Islam. So the mosque is the most prominent structure where Muslims worship. It is dome shape and it's usually pretty prominent. However, this is a picture of the Hajj, which is the once a year pilgrimage for the Muslims. And they also bury their dead, and it's usually in cemeteries. Okay, and last is Buddhism. So Buddhists emphasize meditating and being in harmony with nature. So a lot of their structures are built to symbolize their 5 aspects of nature, which is going to be earth, fire, water, air, and space. They cremate upon burial, and I think we also talked about sky burials in class. They also believe in reincarnation as well as Hindus. All right, guys, here we are on the very last standard 3.8. Yay, effects of diffusion. This standard, you need to explain how diffusion results in changes to cultural landscape. And you need to know those 3 terms. Those are all changes to cultural landscape through diffusion. The first term is acculturation. This is where you may have an immigrant learning a new culture of a new country. For example, if your native tongue is Spanish and you're required to speak English in school, you may become bilingual. That's an example of acculturation. Assimilation is original culture that is no longer noticeable. An example of that would be the Native Americans that were assimilated into a more European culture. And then syncretism is combining a different belief or culture and making a whole new different culture. You see this a lot in religion where you have a biblical worldview and then maybe a pagan worldview. You basically add those together for a brand new religion. Again, those are 3 changes that you see through diffusion. Okay, guys, that is it. I hope you found this useful. It only took me like 100 hours to make today, and I'm really hoping you got your slides filled out for your unit review and feel more confident about Unit 3. All right, catch you on the next round. Bye.